We get the pleasure of building an engine harness for the 2.5RS today, and it is a pleasure because I enjoy doing this. Might I be cracked out? Potentially. Will I pee in a cup for you? Absolutely not. I'm kidding, I'm not cracked out, all right? I just like wires. I like the spaghetti. So on the table, we pretty much have everything we need to be able to build this harness. I am missing a couple small connectors for the pressure sensors. They're called Delphi 3-pin pressure connect. They're just Delphi connectors. I'm missing 3 of them. Now, what we've already done with this harness is we've already split it from the main harness and put it on these MIL-SPEC connectors, call them whatever you want, quick connects, whatever. We've already split the harness into these 2 sections. So we've got these 2 bundles of wires here. We've got all of our, for the most part, electrical connectors, throttle body, air intake, injectors, coil pack, whole bunch of stuff going on in the connectors. I ordered pretty much all of these from iWire. Thankfully, we still have a company with the Subaru stuff that will still remanufacture and still reproduce and sell all of these little connector kits. They come with all of the sealing washer or all the sealing plugs and all of the electrical crimps, so pretty neat. To be able to crimp all this though, you are going to need specialty tools. You cannot, I mean, you can go to AutoZone and just buy a random one or Amazon, but I highly recommend getting some really good electrical connectors because these are really what's gonna make your harness like nice and strong. I've skimped out in the past and I've paid the price. I've lost an engine because I didn't get the proper tools for building the harness. Because we're using a Haltech R3, we had to buy this 6-pin to Bosch 4.9 LSU adapter harness. I don't think we're gonna get into this too much today. A variety of different types of DR25. DR25 is heat and chemical resistant. Love this stuff, been using it on a lot of builds. We got some different varieties of wire gauges and types here. This is all Tefzel from MIL-SPEC. It's really good quality wire. We've got some Kapton tape. This is also heat and chemical resistant. Our labels to be able to label the harness for everything that we want it to say. And we've also got some resin and epoxy to be able to seal up the harness in the areas that need it. Some of you guys asked me to go kind of in depth with this stuff, and I'll do the best of my ability to be able to keep it somewhat digestible. Very first thing you need to know before you even touch that harness or even start trying to build it is what sensors are you using and what's required for sensors, what do you want for sensors. For example, in our engine bay here, just to run over some of the basic sensors that you're gonna need to make an engine operate. Crank position sensor, cam position sensor, injectors, coil packs, intake air temperature sensor, throttle body. That should, for the most part, be like the bare minimum. Now, additionally, I wanted to add extra sensors. So we have oil pressure. Oh, coolant temp is one that you're gonna require. Coolant temp, oil pressure. Oil temperature down there. We've got cam position, AVCS, solenoid, so we're gonna have to wire that up for both sides. Boost controller, we have a coolant pressure sensor that I have out right now. We also have things like fuel pressure, ethanol sensor, a whole bunch of stuff like that. Now, once you've got the basis and I'm using these sensors and you list them all out, the next thing you need to know is what do those sensors require? Some of them might be 2-wire, 3-wire, 4-wire, 5-wire, 6-wire. Is it an AVI, which is an analog voltage input? Is it a DPO, which is a digital pulsed output, which is a switched ground? So there's a lot that goes into this. So after you've determined your sensors and you've determined what wires, if you're curious what wires go to what sensors, you can pull up something like this is, for example, a Haltech wiring diagram. This is the R3 diagram. You can go online and find a generic pinout for a Continental ethanol sensor. You can find all these pinouts online. Print them out. We have them all printed out as well. And then that's gonna tell you what wires you need in order to satisfy that sensor. So once you have that established, then you get to the point of being here. We've got a giant bundle of wires. What we need to do at this point, now that we are at the stage, we have our wires, we know where they go, we know what they're doing, we know what sensors we have, we need to map out the harness. And what mapping out the harness is essentially what it sounds. You're mapping it out in the engine bay for where you want it to route, your wire lengths for where they need to go. I wouldn't say cut the wire exactly where the sensor is. Leave some headroom and some slack on it so that way you can adjust the wiring a little bit as you're building the harness. And we're gonna start to map it out and kind of shape the harness using zip ties. Once we have it mapped out using zip ties, we're gonna go back through the harness, cut all the zip ties off, and as we're cutting them off, we're gonna replace the zip ties with the Kapton tape. The Kapton tape, it's very low profile, it's inexpensive tape, and it works freaking awesome. I'm not gonna keep going past that because we're not even past that point yet. That's where we're at now. So let's get this harness up in the engine bay. Let's start mapping it out. I'll probably time lapse this because it's gonna take me a little while to map it out. I'll do some voiceover and then I'll run you guys through it. Now let's start off with the reason. Why are we building a custom harness for this car when you can buy a factory engine harness and do a merge harness to make it work. Well, the reason for that is I want this harness to do things that a factory harness would be able to do. I want to add things in like EMAP, which is exhaust pressure, coolant pressure, the flex fuel, all this other stuff that can be just integrated into the harness. Additionally, we can also build out this harness to be able to be the correct wire length for where we personally have all of our sensors. With most aftermarket harnesses, you're kind of stuck with whatever the length of the wire is, and then you have to put your sensor wherever that wire will reach. So this lets us kind of do it how we want to do it. Okay, it's been about 4 or 5 hours. This is how far we've gotten so far. So coming off, I'm going to tell you this now, we're a little bit short on harness on this side. That's not a big deal. We can add to it. The only reason that we're short is because I decided to double the harness away from the hot side of the turbo and away from everything hot and run it along the frame rail and then come up and along the engine. If I opted to not do that, we would have been fine over here. We could have also gone down the center of the engine, but with the downpipe coming down and everything, I didn't foresee that being the best option. So our harness comes out of the firewall, goes here, wraps down to the frame rail. Our first breakaway point is right there. Those 2 wires are going to be for the boost controller hiding there. We have one more here, which is going to be for our exhaust manifold pressure sensor, which will tie into the up pipe there. All of this here is going to be for injector 1, injector 3, coil pack 1, coil pack 3, the cam position, the AVCS. And I've got our radiator fan inputs there to run down to our fans for power. Coming along, it wraps under the fuel lines here, comes out. We've got one more breakaway here, which I'll probably kind of tie it into here to wrap it and bring it forward. But this is going to be for oil temperature, oil pressure, coolant temperature, sensor, and throttle body, IAT sensor, and coolant pressure. I think I already said coolant pressure though. We've got one more breakaway here. This is for the VSS sensor and the NOx sensor. So our VSS vehicle speed is there, NOx sensor is here. And then that brings us to this point here where now we have this bundle of wires. So everything here, I don't know if we're going to end up using it all there, but it's going to be for things such as cam position, injector 4, injector 2, AVCS solenoid, ethanol sensor, and fuel pressure. So I'm probably gonna have to extend some of these wires out a little bit. I've mentioned this in the past when it comes to wiring stuff. I do not use solder on this stuff. I refuse to use solder. Solder can crack and break down over time, giving you weak or broken connections. What I use are open barrel crimps. They work awesome. If done right, it is a very strong mechanical connection. On top of the open barrel crimp, we'll also seal up the connection with some 3-to-1 heat shrink to really seal it up and to give it a little bit more strength. So with this half of the engine done, all we have left to do is map out that side. Wire mapping is so important to be able to make sure that you get everything where you want it and to ensure that the harness won't get damaged from heat, chemicals, things like that. Because that's the biggest thing I'm trying to plan out with this harness right now, is keeping it away from all of the hot things, all the super hot stuff. We're trying to keep it away from all of that. Wire mapping is what's going to take you the longest, in my opinion, because you have to know what wires go where, what wires do what sensors need what wires, and where do they need to route in the engine bay and across the engine to avoid things like your exhaust manifold, your turbo, chemical things, hot things, whatever it may be. So this is going to be what takes the most amount of time, and it's pretty labor. That's not labor intensive. It's just tedious. It takes hours. It's been about 5.5 hours and we have the engine harness mapped out for where I want it to go, what wires need to go where. It still looks like a hot mess of spaghetti that's kind of strewn about the engine, but it's all general in the area it needs to be in, the routing it's going to take to get there. So as you guys saw earlier, it comes out, wraps around the frame. I added in our exhaust manifold pressure sensor because I forgot to put that in right here, so that's gonna go somewhere up there. Harness here that's going to do injectors, coil packs, AVCS, that stuff. Main harness comes out the middle for throttle body, sensors, everything up in this area. And then lastly over here, everything's been kind of cleaned up. We've got our branch off for the injector power and coil pack powers. We've got a battery ground here that'll tie into our posts here, and then the additional sensors for fuel pressure, ethanol sensor. That should, for the most part, wrap up the mapping portion of this. So what we need to do now is take all this back out, which is gonna be a little bit of a pain in the butt. But once all of this is out, we can start removing all of the zip ties and actually replacing it with the Kapton tape. And the Kapton tape will keep the harness in the shape that it needs to be in the general format. So right now, all the zip ties, all the bends and everything like that are all just holding the harness in the position that it needs to be. About the engine harness, you guys can kind of roughly see the shape of it. It doesn't resemble it too much right now, but It will soon. These connectors here, where all the zip ties are, up to this point here, we're gonna remove all the zip ties and we're gonna replace all that with Kapton tape, and we're actually gonna sheath up that forward part of it because there's nothing that needs to go in the harness past that point. From here back, that's gonna be a little bit different of a story. So now that we're mapped out, let's just knock out the little piece so that way we can actually get this test fit back in the car and we can start working out all the other stuff. One thing to keep in mind is when you're removing the zip ties and you're replacing it with your tape to keep the harness in the shape that it is, the more Kapton tape you use in specific areas, the stiffer the harness is going to be. As you guys can see, I used a lot of it in that section where we have to route around the turbo, and that's intentional so that way that the harness retains that shape. I don't want it becoming floppy and starting to lean towards the turbo in the future, because the last thing I want is that thing to obviously get burned by the turbo or the up pipe or anything. So the stiffer I can make it in that position, the better it's going to retain that shape. Yes, you can use Adele clamps to hold them down, which is a good thing to do, but this just helps keep some structure in the harness. Rear section sheathed up in Kapton tape, and then we set the harness back in. Now after you get you're gonna have to do this in sections if you want it to come out kind of the way that you want. After we had that Kapton taped, I went through and I started running all of these wires to where they're going to go and all their receiving inputs and outputs, I guess. So here we have coil pack 3, we've got coil pack 1, we've got our thermo fan wires running down. These are 2 cylinder head grounds for the coil packs. We've got injector 3 there, injector 1 here, we've got our cam position sensor there, AVCS solenoid here, so that kind of takes up all the sensors on the passenger side of the head. We've got the exhaust manifold pressure sensor here, and then boost controller right back there. So now we're ready to start moving towards the center of the engine and start getting all of this done, which there's going to be a lot of it in this general area. I do want to kind of explain a little bit for what sensors need what. If you guys are ever curious, there's a lot of documents out there. Haltech actually has a ton of them that I've been using that kind of show, like, your cam position sensor, pin 1 is 12 volt, pin 2 is the home or the reference, pin 3 is your ground, and it'll tell you that for everything. So some of these, they look scarier than they are. The R3 diagram is very easy for anybody to understand, so that's kind of how you have to figure out like what sensors need what. If it's a 12 volt, a 5 volt, an 8 volt, a signal ground, a DPO, an AVI, whatever they might be. Doing this wiring stuff, the first time you do it, it's gonna be intimidating. Like, it's something new, you've never done it. There's a ton of wires and you're trying to make sure they all go in the right spots. So I get it. The first time that you go to do something like this, it's very overwhelming. It was very overwhelming for the first time I did it. But I'm gonna be honest, after you do it once, it's way easier than you might think. It's nice to have the reassurance that when you build your own engine harness like this, you're not gonna have issues. If you guys remember on the RX-7, I bought a pre-made harness for that car. The ignition coils were wired wrong, the fuel pumps were wired wrong, the cooling fans were wired wrong, so we had to go back in there into a harness that I already spent like $1,500 on to tear it apart and fix it. So it's nice to have the peace of mind knowing that all of this is gonna be done right. Back into wire mapping. This time we're jumping into the center section. This is where the vast majority, in my opinion, of the sensors are that we need to wire in. Everything in this area is like coolant temperature, coolant pressure, oil temperature, oil pressure, intake air temperature sensor, throttle body, our VSS sensor, and our NOx sensor are all in that general area. Now, I mentioned earlier, the more Kapton tape you use, the stiffer the harness is going to be. So as I'm coming up, I want this part to lay perfectly flat across the engine, and keeping it a little bit stiffer in this area will help the harness lay down where I need it to. Things are an absolute mess in the shop at the moment, but we're making really good progress on this harness. So what we've been doing, we obviously got things kind of mapped out in the engine bay. I brought the harness back, and then we've been doing a little bit of sheathing right now for what we can do just to start cleaning up the harness. Now, when it comes to sheathing, what you're ultimately going to end up doing is start from the most outside wire and work your way in. Start with all your branches, and then you're going to do like a patch joint, I guess you could call it, with some adhesive lined 3-to-1 heat shrink, and that's going to seal up these branch out points. So we've got one here for injector 3. Our cam solenoid, why is that so short? I may have to extend some of these out, which if I do, that's not a big issue, but I think by doing this, it kind of killed some of my length on these, which if I have to extend them out, like I said, Not a big deal, not a big issue. I can easily do that. This one definitely shrunk down more than I thought it would. I had to humor myself and check. I had to verify. Everything still lines up perfect. So this will sit more inwards because I don't have any of the clamps holding the actual harness down, but you guys can see it runs up. We've got all of our sensors right there. Runs underneath the fuel rail, drops down. We've got our coil pack connections down here. Boom and boom, and then our fans run down also. So pretty stoked with that, actually. Pretty overall happy with that. I wish this wasn't such a tight spot. Maybe I should have done the brake back here a little bit more, but you know what? It's all right. So now what we just did with all of this, we now need to do with the center section. So like I said, you're gonna wanna work from like the outermost section inwards and then start sheathing and heat shrinking just to be able to get the outline of the harness and then get the actual heat shrink tubing shrunk down. Make sure that you're happy with it prior. If you have to come test fit. But so far, dude, that's looking pretty sweet. A couple tips when it comes to sheathing is work from the innermost part outwards. So that, because as soon as you go to like put some sheathing or some clips or connectors on the outside of the harness, you're not gonna be able to get any sheathing past it. So make sure that you kind of think through where you're putting stuff before you shrink it all down. I am on to day 3 of this at this point, and I would like to finish this today. So we almost have the actual harness like built and sheathed and everything like that. Obviously we still have to put some connectors on some stuff, but everything's labeled nicely. Like we have air temp here, drive-by-wire. I didn't see one for coolant pressure, so if I do find one, I'll put one on there. We've got coil pack, radiator fans here, EMAP, cam solenoid, injector 3. This one's cam position sensor, oil PSI, engine temperature, which is coolant temp, our crank position, knock sensor, VSS, and then we've got all of these. So I need to put this harness back in the car one more time so that way I can start doing all of this portion and get it built out how it's going to be ran in the car, because right now I don't know yet. So if I were to just go and like start sheathing this, who knows how it would look or if things would even fit or go where it's supposed to. So there are some things, like I said, I did run out of harness length on this, so I had to go in here, use some of those open barrel crimps, and it's open barrel crimped, it is heat shrinked, and then it is also covered with the Kapton tape, so that'll keep everything nice and secure. Always do a tug test on your wires after you crimp them together like this before you do anything else. Give them a tug test. If they don't pull apart on like a tug test, like I could pick the harness up off of this if I wanted to. Obviously don't do that, but if I wanted to, I could. So if they pass the tug test, they'll be fine. So let's go put this back in the car one more time, get this last section mapped out where it needs to go perfectly, and then we can come back over here, sheath the last of it, put all of our connectors on that we need to, and at that point we will have a full MIL-SPEC harness for the Subaru. Driver's side of the harness is all built out, kind of worked out for where everything is going to route, where it's all going to go. Actually, I need to tape up these wires a little bit, but for the most part, it's all there. So one more time, this harness is going to come out. We're gonna get the last bit of this sheathed, and then we can actually put all the connectors on. And then we have a freaking harness done, which is huge because it's such an undertaking to knock out these harnesses, dude. This one's taken me about 3 days. I haven't been able to work on it every single day, all day long. So in reality, I could probably do it in 2, but this is not something that you typically want to rush. The worst of the harness is done. That's construction of the shape of it, mapping where the wires go, and sheathing it all. That's all done. Now is the easy part where we just put connectors on it. And unfortunately, I don't have all of them, which kind of sucks, but I'll walk you guys kind of through how to do one connector. It's pretty like same through all of them. An injector is a 2-wire. There is no polarity, so you can just put either wire wherever you want. You're obviously gonna need your wiring. You're gonna need your crimper, cutter guides, strippers, and then your proper crimpy crimps. The proper crimpy crimps. Don't use this to crimpy crimp. We'll take our connector pack here and just kind of empty it out on the table. You're gonna have these tiny little green sleeve guys. Part that has more of an opening on it is going to face the end of the wire. And you're gonna slide these on first. It's gonna be the very first thing you do. Sometimes it helps if you twist them a little bit and they'll slide on a little bit easier. And you're gonna slide that down pretty far just so it's kind of out of the way. We're gonna strip just a little bit off. If you need to gauge how much wire to strip off, take your connector, put your wire in it, and then strip off the area that needs to. Now on these connectors here, you're gonna see open end here and an open end here. Both of those need crimped. The first one at this end of the terminal that the wire is gonna go into, this wraps around the coating on the wire. So don't strip it so far back where that is not on the coating, because you want that to be able to grab on and grip. This center portion here is where the wire is, and that's what you're gonna crimp down to keep the stripped wire secure to this connector. And then obviously you have the other end that's terminal that'll plug into our injector. So, and the open end here, that's gonna slide onto the open end of that little green terminal. So let me strip some of these off. I've done enough of these at this point. I know how much I need to take off of them. We're gonna slide our little green terminals up to where we stripped the wire. I'm gonna take our terminal and we're gonna slide it around the green thing so that the back portion of the teeth kind of hug it. Slide in here with our crimps. I like to crimp down the wire first. It helps if you have like a table or something to be able to use to really crimp down on it. Hit this back one here like that. Give it a little crimp down. Give it a quick little tug test to make sure that the wire's not gonna come off, because that's the last thing you want is your wire to come off, especially when you're like driving or you're at Watt and then bad things happen. And then you're gonna slide these into the connector itself. So these do have an orientation. Sometimes you just kind of spin them around until you get the orientation right. Let's say it's about right there. Push the wire in until it's fully seated and clicks. This one has the lock on the face. So you just push that guy in, and now we have a connector on our harness for injector 2. Pretty easy, not too bad. You can give it a little tug test, make sure the wires don't come out. So literally what we just did here to this one, we have to do to the entire harness. So I'm gonna do as many as I can. I know I'm missing some connectors, so we'll do all the ones that I can. Most part, our engine harness is done. I'm missing a couple receptacles on this thing, mainly Delphi 3 pins for all the pressure sensors, because we have oil pressure, coolant pressure, fuel pressure, and EMAP. So I need 4 of these pressure sensors that I'm missing. I need the correct NOx sensor receptacle and coolant temp sensor receptacle and oil temp. But outside of that, dude, there is our harness. This part of the harness is very stiff, and that's intentional. The more of that Kapton tape that you put on this harness, the stiffer it's going to be, and it's not going to want to bend. And with this area all being near the turbo, I didn't want a whole bunch of flex in it because I want it to stay where it's intended to be. The rest of the harness, it's all floppy. You can see like right down there, it's all freaking, maybe if I kick it, it's all floppy down there. That's gonna really depend also on the type of DR25 that you use. If you use adhesive line DR25, it's going to make the harness stiffer. Or if you use more Kapton tape, it's gonna make the harness stiffer. If you don't, it's gonna make it more floppy, like that connector down there. On branch out points, I would suggest you do use the adhesive line DR25. Like you can see, we have a branch out point here. This is adhesive line. This is hard, this is soft. So anywhere where you have a branch out, where you have like multiple wires coming out, use the adhesive line. In the areas where you can, like right here, I just didn't have the right size for the adhesive line, so I had to use non-adhesive. It's not gonna be a big deal. If I see this starting to split at all anymore than it already is, and that was from me overheating it right there, I have that potting compound that we can use to seal this all up. The rest of these sensors, I should be able to wire in with the harness installed. So let's get this thing back in the car for one final time, and then we have technically at this point, everything on this harness, we could run the car on it, but I mean, obviously we can't quite yet. So let's get this thing back in. We have an engine harness, you guys. It's pretty sweet. Honestly, looking at the engine bay, you can't really tell any difference, but coming off firewall here, we've got both our bulkhead connectors wrapping down here, running along the frame rail coming up to our engine. We've got AVCS solenoid, injector 3, cam position, injector 1. Coming down here, we've got coil pack 3 and coil pack 1. I want to say that you guys will see a little bit of excess wire in the harness running around, and that's intentional. I'm not very good at service loops. A service loop is where you put a little bit of extra wire and then you put it in a back housing. I don't have back housings for these also, so you know, we're working with what we can, but I leave a little bit of excess in this, so if I ever have to do a harness repair in the future, there is already excess wire in it, so that way you're not splicing and adding wire in later. We've got our VSS or vehicle speed sensor there. We've got oil temp down there with the wiring just kind of shoved right there right now. Oil pressure, engine temp, throttle body, IAT and coolant temp, or IAT and water pressure. So those will kind of come up and go wherever they're gonna go. I'm not 100% sure quite yet. Injector 2, injector 4, AVCS, cam position, flex fuel, oil or fuel pressure here. And we've got our battery ground going up to our terminal there. So that's pretty sweet. We have a freaking full engine harness at this point. Technically, everything on the engine is all we need to really start and run the engine. We're not gonna do that. Oh, NOx sensor's tucked back there too, but obviously we can't do that yet. Now, while we're here, I do want to shorten these wires here for the alternator. Since we're already doing engine bay wiring, we might as well. So all I'm gonna do is cut this down to where it needs to be so that way it's the right length so we don't have all this excess wire. I'm gonna route it underneath of this here, have it come up, and then just go to our alternator right there. So we've got our alternator wires ran all the way back. I need to order a little sheath spot for this, but I ended up cutting the alternator wire shorter and wiring this in directly to the stock harness so we didn't have to use an adapter. But at this point actually, we have all of the engine bay wiring taken care of with the exception of a couple connectors that I've got on order to be able to wrap this thing up, but technically all the sensors we need to start this thing are on there. Our new hot side for our turbo shipped out. We are using a V-band flange from Borg Warner. It's a prototype one that they sent us, so I'm very excited to get that on there and actually see this engine bay with a turbo and everything else actually mocked up. Because at that point, once the turbo's in, we can do the exhaust, we can do the downpipe, the catback, all that stuff. I don't know if I'm gonna buy a 2.5RS catback or if we're just gonna build one. We'll cross that bridge next week. We also went through and did some spring cleaning in the shop, so we got rid of a lot of stuff in here. It's just, you guys know, we're all car people. We hoard things. We're like, oh man, I'll use this one wire one day. And you know, it builds up to a point where there's just so much crap that accumulates. So it was nice to free up a lot of space in the shop. Additionally, we do have some GR Corolla parts coming that should be here next week. So we're gonna be doing a couple of GR Corolla things while we do wait on some parts in for the Subaru. A couple things that already came in, lit for the GR Corolla, wheel spacers and lowering springs I believe show up in a couple of days. It's weird on the Corolla, in order to run bigger wheels and tires or aftermarket wheels and tires, you need to do extended studs, which is kind of dumb in my opinion, but it's whatever. I bought the extended studs, so in the meantime we can just make the stock wheels look halfway decent. Well, actually, I'm gonna be honest, they actually look pretty good. And then we're gonna be doing some tuning and some other stuff on the GR Corolla next week on some E50. That is all we got on the Subaru for the time being. Huge step forward. All of the wiring, all the major wiring I should say, is now done on the car. Like I said earlier, all that's left is a couple small interior wiring stuff that we'll have to knock out, but we can knock that out in the next video. So with that, that's all I got for you guys on this one. If you're hyped with the progress on the 2.5RS, go ahead and hit that like button, turn it black, blue, green, yellow, purple, silver, cyan, whatever color it turns for you. And if you're not subscribed already and you want to be, I'll put it in one of these corners. No idea which one quite yet, but with that, I will catch you guys in the next one. So peace out, homies. Woo!